The ANC is concluding its 55th National Conference, and the party president, Cyril Ramaphosa, has called for a speedy turnaround time regarding policy adoptions. Let's look at how the party has fared when it comes to policy implementation. I'm joined by Professor Dirk Kotze, a political analyst. Professor Dirk, appreciate your time this afternoon. So the subject matter at hand is the ability of the ANC to implement policy based on some of the resolutions that they've made. How do you think they fare?
Well, I think this is one of the weaknesses of the ANC. I mean, this is not my opinion. It's a general opinion of most people from looking at it from a policy point of view. Policy making, policy formulation, that is better, but the policy implementation part of it, the ANC depends obviously of the government infrastructure. It's not the party who implements, and not even the party leaders in cabinet. It is ultimately the civil service, the public administration that must do most of the work. And I think that is where the gap possibly exists, is between, on the one hand, the political agenda, the political initiatives, and on the other hand, the state capacity in the form of the public administration in all three spheres of government to implement that. A good example of that is, for example, the national health insurance policy that is now more than 10 years in the pipeline, and it's not yet being very much implemented at all.
Now, how does the ANC deal with these shortcomings or these gaps that you speak of? So, on the one hand, there's the aspect of cadre deployment. Is this part of the process where they put in their own people into government in order to impact policy change?
I think that's part of the complication, is that the ANC had two objectives that they wanted to meet at the same time. The one is to implement policy and to achieve the transformation of the South African society in all respects, but at the same time also to have their own people in those positions, and therefore to change the infrastructure of the public sector very dramatically. And I think that is where there were two very important, very major objectives that the ANC couldn't manage at the same time. And I think this is one of ultimately the explanations for the weakness of the implementation, is that many of the persons in implementation positions have become politicians instead of being career officials. And this is what we are now seeing, the first steps by government. End of last year, Cabinet approved a new document which deals with the professionalization of the civil service in general. But that is one of the key elements. At the same time, it is also how to deal with the changing circumstances. You know, when it comes to the ANC, they adopt policy every 5 years at their national conferences. But in between that 5 years, government still governs. And the situation changes dramatically. Just think about the pandemic that came within this 5-year period. And the government had to make changes even to its policy on the spot, and couldn't wait for ANC decisions about policy changes. So I think what we are seeing now is that in some instances the ANC is actually following what government has already implemented or has already conceived as policy before it has been adopted by the ANC policy-making processes.
Well, I suppose supporting that argument is Blade Nzimande, the SACP General Secretary, who talks about, only a few minutes ago, about policy being in existence since 1996. And he argues that some of that policy has not changed, it has not worked. He's talked about unemployment, particularly of young people, and those unemployment figures continue to rise.
Yes, and I think it refers specifically to the 1996 policy, which was called GEAR, and which he and others on the left, especially the communist COSATU, called neoliberal in nature. They call it about the class of 1996, and was aimed at President Mbeki as being moving away in terms of economic policy from what was the ANC's assumed policy at that stage, articulated in the RDP policy document. The same, I would say, what they can say about President Ramaphosa is that since President Zuma, he has made major changes in terms of the economic philosophy that the government wants to implement now. Just look at the energy sector and how the de facto privatization is taking place with SAA, with Eskom in some instances, which are not policy matters or policy principles of the ANC in the past. And the left is very critical of it. Some people are actually saying that the SACP must in next year's election stand out on its own in the election campaign because of that.
Well, in President Cyril Ramaphosa's address as the 55th National Conference resumed, he was quick to say that there needs to be a speedy turnaround time regarding policy adoption. So adoption of policy was one thing. Implementation is obviously another. And it is argued that the party has failed to implement most of the policies and resolutions that it adopted at its 54th elective conference in 2017. How does the ANC move from, yes, let's adopt this policy, to actual implementation?
Well, first of all, they must have a consensus about what is the new policies that they want to implement. And I think that was part of the problem in the past 5 years. The so-called Radical Economic Transformation Group or faction, to a large extent prevented them from having such a consensus. So I think the first task for President Ramaphosa as president in both capacities, ANC as well as national president, is to be able to galvanize this consensus, especially in government, as well as in the NEC of the ANC. Once he has reached that, I think then it might become easier for him, together with then also implementing what is in the pipeline, like what I referred to earlier on, that they have more capacitated persons in the public sector in general who can ultimately implement, because politicians cannot implement. That's not their constitutional responsibility, but it is also, from a practical point of view, it's simply impossible. So the ANC is to a large extent in the hands of the public sector, the public administration. And for them to be able to turn it around, it means that they must turn around the public administration in the first instance.
Now, the next question would be, are the ANC's policies a reflection of what is actually on the ground? Or is it a consultative process when they decide on this policy? Do they consult with their various stakeholders? Do they consult with the people that vote them into office?
Well, when it comes to the ANC's party policy, then it is a process mainly driven by the National Executive Committee. There's the policy committee there, chaired by Jeff Gadebe, for many years now already, plus its subcommittees. And they form also study groups within the ANC. So those are the ones that that's where policy originates from. And that's where the discussion documents for the policy conference 6 months before the national policy comes from. And that is where also some of the policy is being monitored over time. If you talk about the ANC's own infrastructure, not that of government. It is not necessarily coming from the ground, there's no real serious process or established process where branches of the ANC, for example, can make proposals with respect to policy and that it goes up to the NEC ultimately. It's more of a top-down approach. And at the same time, and I think this goes back especially to the time of President Mbeki, where there was a very many plans in place in order to develop an ANC policy-making capacity within it, that it didn't develop, and that capacity was given more or relied on what is happening in the State Departments, where there's obviously more capacity in terms of research, in terms of field work, in terms of gathering comparative studies, and ultimately the writing of documents like white papers or green papers or discussion documents as policy preparations.
Professor Kotze, is this then not a shortcoming in how the ANC comes up with its policy document? Or are there alternatives to doing this? Because one would imagine that if you are assuming representative of the people that have put you into office, that there should be some conversation with at least a cross-section of those individuals or those people to establish what it is that their needs are and then deal with them within your policy implementation.
Yes, I think you are very much correct in that. I think over the years, especially since 2007, when these conferences became more and more events of elections for the top 6 or now top 7, as well as the National Executive Committee, the emphasis on policy becomes less and less. And what we are seeing today, and maybe tomorrow now, is actually symptomatic of that. The fact that they couldn't complete the policy component at the national conference last year because so much time was spent on the election part of it. And I think this is therefore a reflection on that policy took a backseat compared to the political dynamics and the political contestation within the ANC and the positions of persons which they took the front seat. And I think therefore for the ANC to turn itself around, whether it's called renewal or just becoming unified, becoming a new ANC, they must pay much more attention on policy matters. And we all say the ANC has good policies, but I think in some cases there is so much emphasis on policy continuation over the years that they have actually fallen behind in terms of the developments in the world in general, in the economies all over the world, and how it affects South Africa. And for the ANC, therefore, it has to catch up with some of these new developments also.
Now, Professor, before we let you go, if we take a look at the last local government elections and the fact that the ANC performed more dismally than they've ever performed, does the next 18 months offer them a challenge to decide on policy and implement policy in order to protect their votership, if you will, come the next election?
Yes, it gives them a last chance. They have lost already a lot of support in places like Gauteng as a province, but also nationally in terms of its national average. But if they can radically turn around some aspects of it, for example, energy, for example, service delivery, although this is not a local government election, but it is going to be, my prediction, will very much be about people's daily living experiences, about their services that they receive, about electricity, about the infrastructure. And it is therefore for the ANC to present to the public in general a significant change in their approach in the next year at the most, because the last 6 months will be a period of campaigning for the public in order to say, but this is a new ANC. It's a different ANC from the one of 2022.
Professor Dirk Kotze, appreciate your time, political analyst, and packing those issues for us.